Yeah, welcome to our, this morning I have to count one, two, three, to our third forum, this not morning anymore, but now early afternoon. And we have a very distinguished speaker today with Adrian Wooldridge, a very influential journalist, not only in the UK, but worldwide, very well known. Adrian Wooldridge is a great thinker and observer of the modern society, I would say, not only the economy, but also the politics. But not only on politics and economy, but also you have a huge knowledge in history, social sciences, and management. You wrote many books. At the moment, you are the Bagehot columnist. You are the political editor of the Economist. Before those years before, you have been the editor, the column. You wrote the columns Schumpeter and even Lexington when you stayed for many years in the US. So that's a very interesting perspective to our conference this week, where we had at the beginning of the week, we had innovation, then we had climate change. Thursday, we had social responsibility. And today, our focus is mostly globalization, but also the competitive situation on a global international level, where your issue meritocracy has a huge impact on. So there is an interesting link between us. In the late 90s, both of us were fifth order observers of economy or management. There is the workforce, there's the management, there are the consultants, there are the management gurus, and we, both of us, were observers of the gurus. So it was fifth order observer. So you wrote a book. I wrote only in German. I wrote a similar book on the witch doctors. So making sense of the management gurus. This is the link between us. So we got in contact with each other a couple of years ago. And this is a very interesting perspective to observe the world if you do it in the fifth order observation. So if you go down observing others, how they observed and how they are observed by others and so on. So that's the perspective. And from this point of view, we both got in contact to Peter Drucker. For me, it was an empirical research. And I found out even in the early 20 years ago, I found out that Peter Drucker was the most influential management thinker in German-speaking countries, what was quite a surprise because he was more than 90 years old at that time and still alive. And well, that's the link between us.
Yes.
I think in your book, The Witch Doctors, it's an excellent description and analysis on the management industry. You say the authors, the blurb says of the book, the authors profile Peter Drucker and Tom Peters, helping you decide what the Uber gurus can teach you and what they can't. And another coincidence, I had my former boss was Tom Peters. So you really have two focuses in your book together with Adrian, together with John Micklethwaite. Tom Peters, it was my former boss, and I got in contact with Peter Drucker empirically in a way. Okay, your newest book, this is our issue today. The aristocracy of talent, how meritocracy made the modern world. Let's discuss today your thesis, your book, with two focuses. The first focus on the attacks on meritocracy and whether it will survive in the West, the first focus. And the second one, maybe some remarks, what we discussed this morning. Europe's big groups and hidden champions, can they compete in an Asian century? Concerning with the meritocracy issue. So very welcome for you and your speech for about half an hour. But before you start, I have just one remark, and please, Hermann Doppler, help me with Mentimeter. We have a possibility for our guests to give comments on with a tool, an interactive tool, to your thesis in the next, well, half an hour. You can please join our collaborative interactive tool, and Hermann will explain it.
Yeah, we would like to ask some questions and ask you to please answer these questions in the Mentimeter. The access to the Mentimeter, there you can use your iPad, iPhone, or smartphone and use the QR code. Or the other way is to do it direct via www.menti.com and by using the code 25125589. On the other side, you also can use the link. The link I provided in the chat. So please look into the chat. The link is there in the chat. I will repeat this for those who came a little bit later. And
Winfried, thank you very, very much for that very, very kind introduction. And first of all, I'd like to apologize for talking in English. I am a product of the British education system, and unfortunately, we don't put as much emphasis on teaching people foreign languages. We did Latin at school, but not German, so I apologize. I'm going to talk really about how the meritocracy, how the meritocratic ideal made the modern world, how the revolt against meritocracy might unmake the modern world, and how the coincidence of the rise of China and Asia more generally, the revolt against the meritocracy at the same time, what all of that means for the competitive future of the big business groups on the continent and the hidden champions in Germany in particular. And I think the meritocratic ideal is so fundamental to modern societies that we tend to take it for granted. We think naturally that everybody will be judged on their talents, on their raw abilities, on their promise. We think that nepotism and corruption are just not part of the modern world. And we assume that that's just the way things are, that it will always be the case. But if you look outside Europe, you don't have to go very far to find societies based on very, very different principles in which corruption and dynasticism are rife. But if you look also at the history of Europe itself, you don't have to go that far back to find societies being based on very, very different principles from meritocracy, being based on family connection, on nepotism, on the buying and selling of offices. And if you look into your own soul, if you look at your relationship to your children, you realize that meritocracy is a very artificial thing. It's a very difficult thing. You know, we all have a natural biological genetic instinct to favor our children, to make exceptions to our children, to make sure that our children get the best possible start in life. So meritocracy is something that to some extent is a cultural achievement based on the denial of some basic and fundamental human instincts. It's a very recent achievement, and it's a very rare achievement. It's something that's very easy to undo. I think that we need to understand that the modern world, with its systematic expulsion of nepotism and corruption, with its emphasis on fair play and meritocracy, is a very precious creation. That business based on those principles is a very precious creation, and it's not very difficult to see it all falling apart. And I think if we go back a couple of centuries or even a century and a half, we see a world based on very, very different principles. We see a world based on the principle of inheritance of positions, in which everybody's position is predetermined by their parents. We see a world in which lineage matters, in which nepotism is rife, in which corruption is just the way that the world is organized. And we see a world in which all of the basic accoutrements of meritocracy, which is ambition, self-discipline, self-promotion, are verboten. They're not the way that the world needs to be organized. We see a world in which jobs, particularly the jobs of the rulers of society, are inherited, passed down through family. We see a world in which jobs are bought and sold on the basis of patronage or on the basis just of pure money. And a world dominated by kings and aristocrats in which business and the values of business are very marginal in society. I was just looking at Carlyle. Carlyle describes the typical German aristocrat as an ancient, thirsty, thick-headed, 16-quartered baboon. And you see other people writing at the same time as Carlyle, saying that Germany swarms with princes and dukes of whom 3/4 aren't quite right in the head and aren't even competent to rule over chickens. So that was the world that existed until relatively recently. And this was a world that was really destroyed by a number of very radical revolutions, fundamental revolutions in the way that we conducted the world, thought about the world. The most fundamental of these, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, which replaces the rule of these aristocrats not competent to look after chickens, who are basically powerful because they own land, with the rise of the industrial bourgeoisie. But there are also a number of political revolutions which really determine all of this. One is the French Revolution, of course, which replaces a society run by monarchs and run by patronage and preferment and based upon land, with a society much more open to merit. Napoleon talks about everybody carrying carrying in their knapsack the field marshal's baton. And of course, the French Revolution has a very radical and fundamental impact on Germany very, very rapidly. The Battle of Jena is described by Clausewitz as a battle which destroyed the Prussian army more completely than any army has been ruined on the battlefield in human history. And Clausewitz also says that it ruined the case for resisting promotion on the basis of talent. So it's a fundamental battle. Hegel describes Napoleon as history on horseback, bringing a new world and a new way of looking at the world. And you see people like von Hardenberg, people like von Stein saying that we need to reorganize society on the basis of promotion, on the basis of merit, open competition, education of everybody according to their talents, a new world being created. You see that new world also being created in America with the American Revolution, and the American Revolution is not really about equality in its purest sense. It's about promoting people on the basis of their talents and replacing the old aristocracy of land with a new aristocracy of nature. Jefferson is always talking about the aristocracy of nature. You have exactly the same thing going on in Britain at the same time when you see a revolt against the aristocratic elite by the Whig intellectual aristocracy, which says, let's have a society in which jobs in the civil service are open to talent as measured by intellectual tests, examinations. And let's see a world in which we do as the maximum possible to shift power from an old decadent elite to a new rising intellectual elite of talent. And you have open competition put at the very heart of society. In America, in Germany, in France, and in Britain, that is what modernity really means. And you have this principle of meritocracy broadened, constantly broadened out to deal with and to incorporate and to embrace wider and wider sections of the population. So the original meritocrats were about promoting men on the basis of talent. But then women come along and say, why not us? Why can't we do the examinations? Why can't we sit for the civil service? Why can't we have all of these advantages of meritocracy? And indeed that happens. We have the extension of civil service jobs, of educational opportunities, Oxbridge and university professorships, Oxbridge fellowships, university professorships to women. And now there are, at least in Britain, I don't know the numbers for Germany, but there are more women going to university than there are men. So a big change there. You have the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, saying, why not extend these opportunities to us? Why not build a ladder of opportunity? There's a wonderful passage in Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, where the son of the harbour master says, we, the fourth estate, the bourgeoisie, we stand for merit, with the nobility of merit against the old nobility of land, and it's our century now. Then you have the working class coming along and saying, judge us according to the same standards, provide us with educational opportunities, and we will prove that we have the merit to get on in society. Then you have ethnic minorities saying exactly the same thing, particularly in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a wonderful essay on the talented 10th amongst the Black population, saying the talented 10th in the Black population need to be given the wherewithal to get university professorships, to get civil service jobs, to be models of social mobility. And of course, business is based, corporations are based on the idea of promoting people according to their achievements and according to their ability to contribute to productivity. So this extraordinary range of revolutions which embrace every element in society and which result in the creation of a ladder of opportunity from the bottom to the top of society, general education systems, the opening of university places, is an extraordinary revolution. I contended in my book, The Aristocracy of Talent, that this is a revolution just as important as the rise of democracy or the rise of voting rights or the rise of capitalism. It's a fundamental revolution which creates our world. It creates our world. It creates a much fairer world because everybody has some sort of opportunity to get ahead, as against the old world of the landed elites and patronage. And it creates a much, much more productive world. If you look at societies which are productive, which are economically prosperous and economically dynamic, the single thing which most distinguishes them is their embrace of meritocracy, open competition, and non-corrupt way of doing things. If you compare, let's say, Singapore with Sri Lanka, in 1960, they were both at roughly the same economic level of productivity, Sri Lanka a bit ahead, but Singapore embraced meritocracy and shot ahead. Or if you compare, let's say, Sweden with the Congo, you know, one thing that defines Sweden is its commitment to open competition, to meritocratic values, to anti-corruption. So all over the place, meritocracy is the single thing which defines economic prosperity. So you'd think that the West has created this extraordinary thing, a thing that creates a more just society, a thing that undoubtedly creates a more efficient society. But everywhere in the West, particularly in the United States, there is currently a revolt against meritocracy. You have the Black Lives Matter movement, very strongly against meritocracy. You have a number of right-wing populists, most obviously Trump, who can't stand meritocracy because they think it's all about the snobbery of the educated elite, of these dreaded experts to rule society. And you have middle of the road people who work within meritocratic institutions, such as Michael Sandel of Harvard and Daniel Markovits of Yale University, who are denouncing meritocracy as a trap, as an illusion of something that's very wrong. And you have, this is not just intellectuals or intellectuals intellectualizing or protesters protesting. This is something that is changing the way the world works. So the United States, the great universities of the United States are getting rid of SATs. They're getting rid of schools. There was a school in San Francisco called the Lowell High School. They're replacing the application, the admission of people in Lowell High School used to be done on the basis of examinations, was an extraordinary asset for generation upon generation of ethnic minorities, particularly Chinese and ethnic minorities coming into the United States. They're replacing admission with examinations by admission by lottery. Lottery is the least meritocratic institution you could possibly have. It's blind to ability, but they're doing that. They're doing exactly the same thing in the Boston Latin School. They're abolishing gifted educational programs right across the United States. And this is happening at a time when China is re-embracing and modernizing meritocracy. You know, China, of course, as we all know, was the country that probably first invented meritocracy. You know, it had a massive examination system designed to select the best and brightest from right across the country. It had an examination system which was selecting people on the basis of intellectual talent in the 9th century, at a time when Britain was governed by people with names like Eric Bloodaxe. They were governed by people who were brilliant Confucian scholars. And this system of examinations in China was something that that tested about 10% of the entire population by the early Middle Ages. It was an extraordinarily rich system. It was the world's greatest and most advanced examination system. So the Chinese invented this system. Unfortunately, the Chinese destroyed the system in the early 20th century, and they destroyed it on the grounds that it was a system that didn't respond to the needs of a modern society, because it was all about selecting people on the basis of Confucian scholarship rather than on the basis of engineering or science or modern subjects. And then with the communist revolution, they turned completely against the idea of merit and meritocracy. And Mao Zedong in particular, with the madness of the Cultural Revolution, they threw all the experts out. They got rid of examinations. They got rid of grades. They wanted a society based on equality in its purest sense, and on communitarian values and on perpetual protest. But what the Chinese are doing now is reintroducing this ancient system of meritocracy, but they're reintroducing it on the basis not of selecting Confucian scholars, but of selecting engineers, selecting scientists, selecting people who are doing things that invent the future and which power the modern economy. And so they have now an extremely competitive school system, an extremely competitive business sector, which goes through the entire population trying to select people on the basis of talent, and a bureaucracy which tries to do the same thing. Now, there are all sorts of things that are wrong with the Chinese system. There's the power of the red princes. There's a lot of corruption. There's some sort of stratification on the basis just of what your parents did. There are problems with that. But imagine that China is becoming like a giant version of Singapore. Imagine that the corruption is something that they will get beyond, and imagine that they're really, really serious about introducing a meritocratic system, reinventing their old 1,000-year-old system of meritocracy. And imagine if the revolt against meritocracy, which we see in the United States, really takes off, and America moves from a society in which talent, ability, promise are the things that people are looking for, more to a society that's obsessed purely by identity characteristics, particularly racial characteristics, and completely uncommitted to meritocracy. Then what you see, if I'm right in saying that meritocracy is the great power behind economic advance, what you see is the United States crumbling and declining in the long term, and China getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and China essentially becoming a giant Singapore. Then you see the whole axis of power in the world shifting back towards China, as it was, and shifting away from the United States. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is, what does that mean for Europe? What does that mean for the great continental business groups? And what does it mean for the Mittelstand? Now, I think that the situation in continental Europe is not as bad as it is in the United States, and not as bad as it is in Britain, where American fashions tend to come first. And I think the German-speaking world is particularly well protected against this revolt against meritocracy. It has still a system of educational selection. It has a system of educational selection that works much better than the old system of educational selection that we had in Britain, because it gives status to non-academic subjects. It gives status to vocational education. It gives status to apprenticeships. It's a system of selection by differentiation rather than a system of selection by elimination. And I think most of the countries which have the most profound revolt against the meritocracy are those which only think about academic achievements and don't have an apprenticeship system, don't have a vocational educational system, which don't give the right sort of status to engineering subjects, applied subjects, and things like that. So I think Europe is better protected from the revolt against meritocracy than America or Britain, and Germany is particularly well protect against it. And I think the hidden champions are also very well protected against this revolt, because they are very rooted in local culture, very rooted in local towns, because they have a whole culture of emphasis on skills, on practical work, on practical achievements. But I do think that those protections may well not be enough, partly because the Anglo-Saxon world and its culture is very, very powerful, that I predict that this, identity-based politics will spread from Britain to from the Anglo-Saxon world to Germany and become very powerful in Germany, partly because you have a strong tradition of leftist criticism of the capitalist status quo. And I think the identity politics is not as advanced in your country as it is in ours, but it is taking off. It appeals very strongly to the young who don't like capitalism, who tend to be in search of a sort of identity, or very involved with identity things, and very angst-ridden about where they get their values from. And I think you will pick up on that. And so I think there will be a current of anti-meritocratic thinking in the United States. I was just looking; it's very strong now in the Scandinavian countries, and I think it will spread throughout Europe. And I think it's also the case that whilst we're engaged, and you will be engaged, and probably are currently engaged in some sort of angst about meritocratic calculations, the China and the Asian countries are leaping ahead. They're not standing still. They are putting more and more emphasis on achievement, more and more emphasis on purifying themselves of corruption, more and more emphasis on technical training, engineering, scientific training, and being economically competitive, I think, in certain really crucial areas of high brain power work, which involves, selecting people very intensively from a young age for intellectual achievement, particularly AI. I think the United States is ahead of America now. Many military technologies, partly because the military-industrial complex in the United States is such an old boys club. They have pulled ahead, and they will continue to pull ahead. So I think the axis of the world is turning towards Asia. The big business groups and the Mittelstand in Germany are more protected against the revolt against meritocracy than is the case in America, but they're not fully protected. And unless something is done to bang the drum in favor of meritocracy and to bang the drum against this sort of current of identity and anti-meritocratic politics, which is sweeping the world, then the future will be absolutely a nation century, and a nation century in which we in the West don't even have a look in. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Adrian. Thanks a lot. So I always learn a lot from you, from your perspective, from your historical and from your scientific approach with all those aspects you brought into your thesis on meritocracy. I would like to discuss two aspects. If we are, let me start with a part of a book I remember.
Mentimeter nicht vergessen.
Ja, das stimmt, aber das muss ich jetzt kurz sagen.
Ja, klar, ja, okay.
Yeah, you're right. Hermann reminds me that we have some resonance, so we should. But your theses are so hot, so I have to answer it at once. I can't. We will do the tool with our guest. We do it a minute later. Thanks, Hermann. It reminds me to a part of a book from Peter Drucker where he said, if you have a look to the world economy, it has always been a Chinese economy for for the most of the time of the human history. Until the Middle Ages, China was the center of the gross world product. So more than 50, 60, 70% of all economy has been at the center of China. So for most of the parts of the human history. And for example, when Drucker talked about knowledge society and the knowledge worker, he mentioned as well that in China, in let's say 500 years ago, it was the part of the world where every year 10,000s of knowledge workers came out and emerged from those training school, university institutions. And in Germany, compared, the first university appeared in the 14th, 13th century, in Spain a little bit before, and there were a couple of, well, academic people. So if you compare Europe and China and East Asia, it's the human history is always the knowledge has been in China. So, and for me, this brings me to a point what you mentioned. What happened with the Western Revolution in terms of political revolution, being able to vote, one man, one vote, and so on, and the revolution of the meritocracy system. It brings me to an aspect where is there something in the culture, in the history, in the mindset of our people, of our cultures? There is, for example, from Jin Li, a study about the cultural foundations of learning in the East and the West, and she says, or he says, I don't know whether it's a he or she, Asian children are more resilient.
Yes.
Difficulty is a spur for effort and not an excuse for
Absolutely.
giving. Yeah. So this is one point. And if we take, for example, the German situation, you are right. We are a little bit in a better shape than a lot of other worlds and countries. We protected a lot of parts of the meritocracy system. But if you look at the results of 15 or 16-year-olds in Germany, which are, well, the results, you know, the PISA system and so on, the best results in Germany have immigrants from Vietnam. You know, the boat people in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And it's far beyond every immigrant group in Germany, and they are much on a higher level than, well, the Germans in general. So this brings me a question to you. What can we learn, well, from these facts?
Sure. I mean, I think there's first of all, to comment on your points about Drucker's theory of China, and China as a manufacturing center, great manufacturing center of knowledge workers. I mean, it is extraordinary how huge the examination system was and how early on it was established. So as I said, 10% of the population doing these examinations, and not all of them became Confucian scholars or Mandarin civil servants, but all of them absorbed an enormous amount of knowledge and sort of infused that society with knowledge. 10% is a huge percentage. I mean, Britain, up until the middle of the 19th century, England had 2 universities, essentially Oxford and Cambridge. They had a system which was training people right across the country. And training, you know, not just the rich, you know, a lot of people right across the country. So it's an extraordinary achievement, which is being reinvented at the moment. And China was the dominant economic power in the world through most of human history. There was a brief and peculiar period from about 1800 to the middle of the 20th century when China was very weak and basically collapsed, and the West was very strong. And that's the period we think of as normal. It's not normal, that is an abnormal period in human history, and we're moving back towards a world in which, you know, normality is resumed. And I think we should not forget how deep the humiliation of the Chinese was, the humiliation of seeing Westerners in their territory, telling them what to do, setting the pace of history, and they are determined to turn that around, absolutely determined to turn that around and to restore what they think is the natural order of things. And we should not ever underestimate their determination, which brings me to the bigger point of decadence. I think the problem with a lot of the poor performance of children in Europe and the United States is that we've become very, very decadent. We assume that we're on top of the world, and we don't realize that there are large numbers of very able, very hungry people who are there willing to eat our lunches, as it were. And it's very hard to say to a prosperous country, unless you keep working really hard, you're in big trouble. And we see it every day. But if you look at the performance of children in, as you talked about, the Vietnamese or China or Singapore, I mean, it's absolutely essential, extraordinary. The school that gets the most people into Oxford and Cambridge is not in England, it's in Singapore. The school that gets the most people into Harvard is not in America, it's in Singapore. It's the same school. It's sending just these extraordinary numbers of people. And these are people who are, very, very committed to work, perhaps, to some extent too committed to work, to academic work. But, we have the standards now increasingly are being set in Asia. And that is very, very profoundly the case in business as well. And I think a lot of the standards, I see a century in which great innovations in the corporate form, in business practices, in business thinking will be coming from Asia rather than from the West. We're at the beginning, at an early stage of these centuries, of that century.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm lecturing every year with Korean students from Seoul National University in Berlin, and I'm always absolutely amazed about their ability to be open to meritocracy and to be hungry and to learn from the German economy and culture but now we have to integrate the Mentimeter tool to see what's the result of our guests on the thesis of our forum this afternoon. Herman, please.
Oh, I hope I have the right one. Yeah, you see it?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so very relevant, the meritocracy for the modern business world. So our guests agree. Next slide. Will meritocracy survive in the Western countries? Almost the same, quite high level. Thank you. Is meritocracy nowadays more relevant in the East Asian countries than in the Western countries? There is a little lower yes on that. So we still, as you mentioned, Adrian, we still have some parts of the Western world where it seems to be quite okay, in a better shape. Thank you. And the last one, what are the positive aspects of meritocracy in the business world? Here are your comments. It gives us the drive we need to create the future. Effective work and products progress in the economy. Every person can grow in their capabilities and talent. Then open competition based on talent and not on descent. And then a better delivery of quality output. High effectiveness grow in the economy. This is a German. Competition leads to more performance, and it is the basis for success and competence. So some remarks from you, Adrian, on those aspects.
Well, I'm delighted that people are so confident about how the system works at the moment. But what really worries me is that there is a very powerful set of opinions, whose capital is the United States, which are arguing against open competition, arguing against competence, and arguing that because of certain past injustices, we should be more and more thinking in terms of identity and categories that people might belong to, which are essentially ascribed categories such as and I think that that is potentially very dangerous. And the great emphasis in American business thinking at the moment is on this notion of diversity. And diversity, I think, comes in two forms, one of which is fine and the other which is profoundly worrying. The good version of diversity, the good idea of diversity, is to say that there's a lot of ability in various underrepresented groups, and that we must do as much as we possibly can to discover that ability. And that is absolutely right, and that's 100% in accordance with the meritocratic tradition. It is definitely true that certain groups are underrepresented because of historical injustices, and we ought to be dealing with that. But there's a second notion of diversity, which is a very fundamental idea, and that is that different groups of people have a different outlook on the world, which is rooted in their ethnic identities, that they see the world in different ways, that they have different experiences of the world. And because of this experiential, ethnically rooted set of differences, we must have a workforce which represents all of those groups, because those groups bring to the workforce peculiar sets of experiences. And that is the predominant view in the United States at the moment. It goes back to the Bagehot case at the University of Texas in the early 1990s. That case said you cannot discriminate on the basis of affirmative action. That is wrong, but you can discriminate on the basis of the learning capabilities that people bring to their jobs based on their ethnic identities. I think that was a real turning point in Western thought, and a very, very bad and dangerous turning point in ethnic thought, because the idea that people have a certain way of looking at the world, which is intrinsically part of their gender or ethnicity, means that you are judging people not on the basis of their talents, but you are judging them on the basis of which sort of biological group they belong to. And that is basically going back to a pre-modern way of thinking about the world. When I talked about, what meritocracy has done is to replace the idea of judging people on the basis of what groups they belong to with judging people on the basis of their individual abilities. And we're going back to that pre-modern view of the world, the idea that peasants, as it were, are fundamentally different from lords. That is very dangerous.
Yeah, what you mentioned as well, which is quite interesting, we had discussed it, or I brought it in Tuesday afternoon. We had a discussion on administrative, on the public sector, and the possibility how to modernize and to make it more digital. And Germany is in the international ranks quite on the last third of the OECD countries in terms of modernizing the public sector and digitalizing. And you mentioned Stein-Hardenberg, and that's exactly maybe gives us a hint from the history that even after a crisis, and Prussia has been burned down by the Napoleon Wars. It has been kind of a destroyed state, an absolutistic state that has been break down. And then it was the fundaments of the feared Prussian effective state, national state, which within 100 years was able to compete on the European level among all those European conflicts. But in positive spoken, I think we can learn from Stein-Hardenberg and from this situation in the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, where Wilhelm von Humboldt started the German exactly 1807, 1808, 1809, where Humboldt started the fundaments of the German university, of the German education system. And some years later, in the middle of the 19th century, from South Germany, a former mining director was the man who invented the dual education system, where we in Germany have, you can say, a quite clever separation between talents of young people, where you have the craft, the hand people, and we have developed this dual education system where we have world-class workers, shop floor workers. They are precise, they're doing the right thing. The Japanese call it monotsukuri. That means doing things right. So you reach a special level with crafts, with production, where you don't deliver a bad quality. It's kind of a self-esteem from this part. So we have the hand part of the education system. We have the head part of the education system, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, Wilhelm von Humboldt. And then we have also the heart in each country, where at the moment we in Germany are suffering. Maybe I don't know the situation exactly in the UK is similar to the UK, where Boris Johnson had COVID-19 some months ago, and he mentioned that Pakistan
that's right.
Survived him. And at that moment, the attacks on minorities in the UK went down almost to zero when Boris Johnson said, we have such warm people, and it's also a big part of modern society, where you find talents of each part in the society. Modern society can only survive, and in East Asia, the Chinese, for example, they smile to Western Europe or to those welfare states like Germany, where they say, there are two systems: the Chinese meritocratic leadership, where engineers is on top, on science is on top on everything, but if you take, for example, the Politburo of the Chinese government, 2002 to 2007, all 7 members were engineers.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then all but one, and now Xi Jinping is a chemical engineer as well. So is there, from your point of view, my question, with that background, the focus, as you mentioned, in East Asia, especially in China, is, put meritocracy on a kind of national strategy of the economy to be number one, and everything is focused on this goal to recover as a Chinese nationality to be number one, and the whole system is of a small elite directed to this direction. And in the Western worlds, we are a little bit more open to diversity, as you mentioned. In the US, totally diversity on some revolts. And let's start with some kind of conclusions. What can we do to improve it? You already mentioned some parts, and you mentioned, for example, some European cases and models which are in a better shape. But how can we help even the US to do not, in a long term of 50 years, like Detroit, reach at the second league of nations?
Well, let me say, first of all, that on the dual education system, I think the dual education system has enormous advantages, but one of these advantages is to be a sort of defense against the revolt against meritocracy. That, the countries that are suffering the most vigorously from this anti-meritocratic sentiment, the United States and Great Britain, are countries which have no very strong tradition of vocational education or apprenticeships of the rest of them. Or America, which has a strong tradition of it, is actually sort of abandoning that tradition and becoming obsessed by the single academic pyramid of talent. So, something like MIT was meant to be a sort of practical university to some extent, and it's become now a very, very high-level academic university. The whole status system in America is being taken over by not doing practical things, but by the head rather than the hand. And I think that is a problem, and you have a huge advantage in that. So I think, and one of the things that most amuses me, I won't go through this talk without mentioning Brexit, because Brexit is compulsory for all British people to talk about. But one of the interesting things that's happened after Brexit is that Britain is trying to become much more German. And the Boris Johnson's government is very preoccupied by certain German qualities, particularly technical education, apprenticeships, and trying to create sort of lots of clusters of excellence around the country, rather than just having one great cluster of excellence, which is London. And so there's the interest in Germany is much greater now, the German model, than it was before the Brexit exit. And I think that they're right to want to do those things, although whether they can do them, I'm not sure. In order inoculating ourselves as a system, I think it's very, very difficult to do that, because I think there is a level of decadence and introspection which is quite extraordinary, particularly in the United States. Because the United States is so big, everything in America is about America. And every problem is about America. And increasingly, the only thing that matters to Americans is the culture wars. You know, the left believes one set of things, the right believes another set of things, and they fight each other constantly. And none of them seem to understand that while they're fighting each other, like dogs, cats and dogs, there is another civilization, business civilization, arising in China and the Far East, which is extremely powerful. So they've taken their eye off this competition. That it needs to be something like a Sputnik moment when America realized that Russia was pulling ahead. We need another Sputnik moment to show us that we're not alone in the world and that the Chinese are advancing at a great speed. And yet there should have been a Sputnik moment. If you look at what happened in Hong Kong, that should have alerted us to the fact that this is a very powerful and expansionist civilization. And there's no interest in that, you know. It's something that we've all forgotten about. As I say, I went to see a company, a high-tech company recently that said in no uncertain terms, the Chinese are ahead in AI. And this is a company that's on the very forefront of AI. And I think we should be waking up to that fact. But our desire to fight the culture wars is so overwhelming that we will not look at the geography of business. I think events like this one, you know, should be encouraged, you know, as a way of showing us that there's more to the world than our back gardens.
What I liked very much at the end of your book, the death of Venice. You mentioned
yes,
the death of Venice, where in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, Venice has been kind of a hub in the modern world, and then something happened that this wonderful city, you said a level of decadence. What happened in Venice a couple of hundred years ago? Maybe you can just mention the situation. Yeah.
Venice was was in many ways the most economically powerful city-state in Europe throughout much of the Middle Ages. And then it did a series of things, and it was powerful because it was an open economy with an open elite, open to the world through trade. And these incredibly beautiful buildings were created because it was such a prosperous and open society. And what happened was that the elite basically built up a series of barriers to prevent new people coming into the elite. And it created this sort of golden table in which it actually listed all the families who were eligible to be part of the elite. It got rid of open competition. It got rid of a system whereby it was easy to create companies. And essentially the elite closed itself off to new recruits. And as a result of that closure, it became a moribund economic force. It went into decline. It's remained a beautiful city, but it was a city of monuments, which tourists came to and looked around. If you go to Venice now, a vast number of the tourists are Chinese looking at this great city. But that is a possible future of Europe, that Europe will just become a tourist trap to Asian tourists. It will cease to be an economically creative place. And a big chunk of Europe is nowhere near as beautiful as Venice. So if you're living in a post-industrial city, you haven't even got the beauty to compensate you for that. So I think it's absolutely vital that we understand what are the sources of the West's competitiveness, and that instead of damaging or restricting or limiting those sources. We should cultivate them. And I think absolutely central to the West competitiveness is open competition, competition done on the basis of looking and finding people of promise and allocating them to the best jobs, the jobs most suitable to their abilities, and of using that open competition as a basis for economic prosperity. And the extent to which we dilute that or go off after other things like identity issues and classifying people on the basis of their identities, or closing entrance to companies to certain groups because they don't fit certain stereotypes. That's a terrible idea. We need to be as open as possible. And by open, I mean not just letting in already very well-educated groups, but searching society actively for promise and making sure that we get hold of all that promise and harness it to our collective good.
Yeah. In Italian, it's called la serata.
That's exactly right, la serata, the closure.
This closure gives us a hint to Europe, to the Europe's and to US situation. So I think it's absolutely an excellent example that you pointed out in your book, where, well, to hoard opportunities and strangle innovation and keep newcomers out and reduce the openness of a country and the society and trading, that's the beginning of the end of the story. So if the elites lose touch with the society because they are on a decadent level, then that's the beginning of the end of the story. So I think it gives us a big lesson on Europe, on the situation in Europe, and on the situation in the US. And me as well, I'm more concerned with the US for the next decades, like for Europe. But even if we become a tourist place for Asian visitors, it's just a brief story. Some 2 years ago, I've been in the movie theater, and I said after 10 minutes, I thought something is wrong. I'm in the wrong movie, and I was right. I switched to in a big movie theater hall. I went into the wrong room, but it was amazing. It was a film of a Chinese tourist association who did research on Hallstatt. This is near Salzburg, in the mountains of Salzkammergut, and they did for many. This hotel manager has been interviewed, and she was wondering why Chinese are staying not for a day or two, but for weeks, for 2 months. And it was a group of Chinese making photographs and doing everything, making plans of this Hallstatt. And then this Chinese company built up the same small town in China.
Yes.
And there is a copy, 100% copy of Hallstatt somewhere in the.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So if you take the view of the Chinese society, well, Europe is a picturesque place, and well, let's take, before it's destroyed, take some copies of it that they can survive in China. If this is our future, wow.
Yes, right. Very good.
It was the wrong movie, but it was the most shocking movie.
Yes, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Serendipity is the way forward. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's now 2:00, and we have some more minutes for the questions of our guests and audience. Please use the reactions of Zoom. Lift a hand, please, or maybe Harman, is there someone in the chat that you can summarize?
Yes. First, there is there's told this is a breathtaking speech from you, Mr. Wooldridge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
People will buy your book immediately.
That's vital. Yes.
Then there's one comment. China is on the way to rebuild the dual education system, like in Germany.
Yeah.
That had the same system. They had the same system in the past, but after the reform and opening all young people want to study in universities, and that system was destroyed consequently. Now they have learned that the economy requires better educated blue-collar workforce. The dual education system is a great model. It's efficient and builds quality into products. This is one comment there. And then there is a very interesting, thank you for this, it is a purpose-focused education system. Is there a comment? Then I would ask something from my point of view. From my understanding, what I see so far, it's the main topic to keep the meritocracy and the social economy in a balance. And what we are facing always is, what is a balance? And do we have the same understanding of the balance? Yes. And not having the same understanding of the balance gives those the room to destabilize the system, those who are ideological driven. So and if I look, and then for me there's a question, according education system. I look at the moment to Germany. We are since years we are talking about more qualification in the direction of economics in the school. Yeah. This is not really working very proper. The other point is, how is it according, the dependencies, the interdependencies between the economics, the business management, and the entrepreneurship. Also entrepreneurship, we have a gap. If we look to the situation in Germany, there are non-government organizations what are very busy on that. There's a Mannheim one, Hauke Schwitzer is the boss of this. They try to train people when they are still go to school. They are, but the school, our teachers, we are not able. This makes me a little bit nervous, I would say. What will be the result in the future? What is your experience there? What is necessary? What is not necessary? What's too much, for example? I don't know.
Well, I think this is the area where America still retains an extraordinary degree of preeminence, this area of entrepreneurship. I mean, it's sort of in their culture, risk-taking as a sort of way of life, but also the provision of venture capital, the role of universities in supporting innovative ideas and commercializing innovative ideas. That is still America's big comparative advantage, particularly Northern California. But one of the things I've noticed recently is that if you look at the world's, if you look at the list of companies that are worth more than $100 billion and that are less than 20 years old, most of them traditionally have been American. Now, a lot of them are still American, but there are also a very significant number of them that come from China or Southeast Asia. And obviously China, the People's Republic, but also companies of that valuation that are headquartered in Singapore in particular. So it does look as though Singapore, Southeast Asia, plus of course China, are beginning to master the art of entrepreneurship. Now in China, it might be the state pouring vast amounts of money into particular things. In Singapore, it does look that you're getting a new generation of entrepreneurs who have access to capital markets and who can work at commercializing new ideas and are doing so on a massive, massive scale, let's say more than $100 billion. And if you look at this list, it's dominated by America, Asia, and Europe is absolutely nowhere. Just doesn't exist in that list. Europe is living on its seed corn. It's living, if you look at the list of big companies in Europe, almost all of them were founded before the Second World War. There's Denmark might have a few exceptions. They're very good at innovation. Some Nordics, but not Germany, not France. Britain, certainly a little bit, but not for really, really big companies, not $100 billion. We have smaller companies. And that's extremely worrying. So I think we do need to find a way of protecting and preserving the meritocratic spirit, but also infusing it with an entrepreneurial spirit. And Singapore is proving that you can have both. Some people would say, well, you can, if you have a really meritocratic-based educational system, it squeezes creativity out of people. I don't think that's increasingly not true of Singapore, and it's not true of Korea in the way that it used to be true of Korea. We all used to be worried that Korea had these great chaebol founded, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it wasn't creating any new companies, and it wasn't creating any real cultural innovation. But indeed, that's not the case at the moment. I remember, and this is a measure of my ability to analyze things. About 15 years ago, I went to Seoul to see Jeffrey Katzenberg of DreamWorks presiding over a big ceremony in which South Korea's age of cultural production was going to be started. And they said, look, we have a national plan to produce pop music and to produce films and to produce videos and to dominate culture. And they worked with DreamWorks in producing this national plan. And I wrote a very arrogant article for The Economist saying it's all impossible. They've got no chance at all of dominating the world of cultural creativity. You can't plan this sort of thing. It all comes naturally. And Korean culture is a bit weird, and they definitely won't succeed in this. And now everywhere I look, we have K-pop, we have Squid Games, we have Korean films, we have Korean food. They're completely dominating our culture. So it's my incompetence, but B, the extraordinarily, what the Asian Renaissance is about is not just about semiconductors, not cars. It's also now about culture, cultural power. They're applying the same techniques to culture, and they're working. So
maybe I can mention just one speaker of our Purpose Summit last February here at Mannheim. We had it before the pandemic. We had a Korean entrepreneur. He was he started his business 50 years ago, and in a business that you mentioned. So he's health food, in the health food sector, and he is in Korea #1 for health food and expanding to China. So Seung Wo Nam from the company is called Pulmuone. That's an example, as you mentioned. So we don't. And there is a similar story about glasses, a glasses crafts company in Berlin, run and developed by young Koreans. So within 3 hours, you get exactly the glasses you need with a brilliant design. It's a Korean company in Berlin, and they are young people and have the feeling for the young Berlin people. And as you mentioned, they emerge in Asia. They emerge especially in those countries with the democratic background, where you have a huge civil society movement in different directions. The German sociologist Niklas Luhmann would have said a differentiation of a country, of our society. Korea is an extremely differentiated society with aspects. I'm frequently there, but every time you have something new. There is a Tufts University professor, Amar Bide, his name.
Yes.
You know him, Amar Bide, yeah. And he examined, well, what are the success factors for companies in the modern world. And one aspect he said is one very important aspect is what we forget in most organizations and management, that you have to look for the coolest clients, for the most innovative clients, you have to have a ecosystem of the coolest clients. And Korea has absolutely cool clients. They are fast. They are pioneers, and they use the product even if it's not ready, but they want to have it. And for even if a recommendation from our forum today, from my side to our audience, is Korea is an example in East Asia where you can learn a lot because of innovative clients. The people, and I know a lot of young people, and the person I mentioned, Sung Wo Nam, with Pulmone, his company on healthcare food, he is very successful, and he's spreading from Korea to other parts of China and other Southeast Asian. And for example, he's I don't know if it's still, if it's after the crisis between trade of South Korea and China still is like that, but he was the #1 for kind of European food, Italian food, noodles. A Korean is really? #1 in the noodles, European, like spaghetti, in China. So this is another example where you can learn, as you mentioned, when you predicted no chance when you wrote it in the Economy. And sometimes we are totally wrong. What's happening there?
But I was just thinking about the innovative consumer. Is absolutely vital. But this brings me to a puzzle in my mind, which is Japan. Japan is full of incredibly innovative consumers who are absolutely at the forefront of consumption in games and pop music and all sorts of clever consumer things. And yet Japan has gone from being this great exporter of its culture and of its innovative electronic products to being an also-ran. I can't quite understand that. I mean, Korea is now doing what Japan was once doing, but why has Japan exited so many of these markets, despite having a very innovative set of consumers at home? Because if you go to Japan, you're amazed by they've got all these products which we haven't got in the West, you know, all these clever things that everybody's looking at, but they don't seem to be part of our culture anymore in the way that they, you know, Sony Walkman defined an era, but it's not happening anymore.
Yeah.
Herman?
We have one raised hand, Alexandro.
Yes, hello to everyone. And
how do you do?
Firstly, as a business engineering student, I want to express my gratitude for having the privilege to participate in this meeting. First, I want to ask, with my untrained eye and my young mind, let's put it like this, I sort of see a life cycle of countries. Correct me if I'm wrong. Somehow I observe that there is a cycle that is going in society, which goes up and down. Let's say, if I can put it in this image. And me as a future actor on this planet, in the society, how can I contribute to this? To linearize, let's say, this graph that I just proposed. That's the first question. And the second question is if this meeting is recorded somehow, because I would like to spread the word.
Sure. I mean, I think there is a problem of you're referring to, you know, the rise and fall of civilizations. That civilizations, you know, every successful world dominant civilization in the past has eventually passed its peak and gone into decline. And I think that the reasons why nations fail is partly complacency, as I say, which leads to decadence, but it's essentially opportunity hoarding by elites, which keep their positions and refuse to enter open competition with rising elites. So you have a decadent elite which is holding on to its power. And you have, as I said, in the case of Venice, which is the most extreme example of this, a sort of turning an elite into a ruling class, which also then turns into a ruling caste and doesn't admit new members. And my biggest worry about what's happening into the West at the moment is a worry related to meritocracy, that what we have is an elite which considers itself to be a meritocratic elite. It considers itself to be defined by its educational qualifications, but it is in fact, under the surface, really a plutocratic elite, which these are the children of people whose parents have bought better educations for their children, either through private education or sending their children to very well and successful state schools, which reflect the characteristics of rich catchment areas, essentially. And we're not doing enough. That group of people, many of whom came of age in the, after the 1960s, they did very well in the housing market. They've done very well in hoarding resources. That they're pulling, essentially what they're doing is pulling up the ladder after themselves. And what they're not doing is doing enough to recruit new talent from new and underrepresented groups, primarily not primarily, but the old working class being one of them, but also new immigrant groups. And what we must do is revive the meritocratic ideal and make it more relevant to new groups in the population, and make sure that this successful group of people, and I'm a prime example of that group of people, don't just hoard opportunities and pass it on to their own children at the expense of wider society. And I think that in that you talk about rises and fall, the history of meritocracy has always been in the past a system whereby groups that prosper under meritocracy have broadened the ladder. So in the mid-19th century, you had a lot of educated middle-class people who came along, created open competition, and then they broadened that out. They broadened it to women, they broadened it to working class people, they broadened it to ethnic minorities. There was a big push to create mass educational systems in the early 20th century, and again after the Second World War, and again after the 1960s. And what we need to do is have another big push. So the worst thing to do at the moment would be to say meritocracy isn't working, let's get rid of it. To the extent that meritocracy isn't working, we need to revive, refresh, renew, and extend it. So I think that is the way forward at the moment. And we need to use new sorts of tests. We need to use new markers to find talent in society. We need to make sure that we're selecting people or looking for people or giving people opportunities at very, very young ages, because so much of your abilities are set down when you're very young. So I think that is the way forward. So I look for a period of renewed meritocracy.
Thank you.
Herman.
There's one comment in the chat. US, Australia, and much of Europe have all suffered from the PISA shock with the high scores achieved by Singapore, and also Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, and China's richer areas. According to a recent OECD study, however, those countries' children don't perform any better per study hour invested. They just study far more hours than we do. Is there a relationship?
Well, I think that's understating what's going on. Again, I quoted this example earlier of Raffles College in Singapore, which is phenomenally good at getting people into Oxford and Cambridge, but also into Harvard. I mean, it's one of the world's most successful schools. And it's not just that they're studying harder, although I think they are working very hard, but it's also what they're studying. These people are all doing A-levels in maths, further maths, triple maths, quadruple maths. They're all doing these highly intellectually demanding subjects. And they're all, you're sending your talent in vast numbers into engineering, into biochemistry, into all of the subjects that are creating the future. And I think that is an extremely worrying thing from the perspective, particularly of the United States, and even more particularly Britain, where so many people do arts subjects, which are marvelous, but aren't really inventing the future in that way. And I think Herman, I think Winfried said something very interesting earlier on. He pointed to work, which shows people's attitude to effort. And we tend to think that we tend to have a low opinion of people who work really, really hard, but don't do particularly well. And so we have this tradition in Britain of effortless superiority. If you can do really well without working, you're a great person. If you do moderately well and work very hard, then that's terrible. But it seems that the Asians value work in itself, that somebody who is working really hard, even if they don't do brilliantly as a result, is doing something very moral, is doing, they're trying their best and they're getting, whatever result they get is the result of their effort. And that is a cultural difference. I don't know if it's to do with Protestantism and the notion of the elect or whatever it's to do with, but this cult of this notion that effort is in itself a moral thing is extremely intriguing, I think, and seems to be doing extremely well for those countries right across Asia. It seems to be a common set of assumptions in those societies that if you work hard, that's all that matters.
There is a comment from Grace Fu. That's correct. That Chinese children study many more hours than children here in Europe. Each day, the education system in China is a selective system. In China, if you don't study hard, you won't have a chance to get higher education, says Grace Fu.
Now, you can take this too far. If people are studying to the detriment of their health, that's a terrible thing. You need to, a balanced education, an education which puts emphasis on, physical fitness and all of that sort of stuff is very, very important. But I think there's a very interesting measure of this culture of working hard, which is demand amongst Chinese children for eyeglasses, which seems to have been going up and up and up. More and more and more of them need eyeglasses, perhaps provided by your Korean entrepreneurs, because they're studying so long. That may be going too far, but it's very important to understand that we are in a competitive world in the West, that our children are competing with children in Singapore and China in a globalized economy. And as I said earlier, this evidence that I've come across that AI and a lot of areas of high tech, China is now not just equal, but is actually pulled ahead and is more innovative than Silicon Valley, is extremely, extremely interesting. And if we've always thought of them as fast followers and being very good at imitating, but if they're pulling ahead, and particularly in areas sensitive to the military industrial world, that is a new period we're entering into. And I would say of all those people who say that the Chinese are not good at, or the Singaporeans are good followers, but not very good at innovation, they're going to make exactly the mistake that I made about the Koreans and K-pop and culture back 15 years ago, which is to underestimate, never, ever underestimate your competitors. And I think we've been guilty of doing that with Asia for a long time.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, is there another question from our guests? Then I think it's time to summarize. Adrian, you said meritocracy succeeds because it does a better job, and we need a wiser meritocracy with more paths, especially in Europe, if we have a chance to compete in a way with Asian countries. And I had once an article in a Korean newspaper where they talked with me on one aspect, and I think that's kind of a good way for us in Europe. In the Economist, there was once about Korea. There was once an article, and you said, a colleague of you said, Korea is a one-shot society. So you have in Korea, you have one shot. It's the exam when you are 18 years old at the end of the school.
Right.
And if this shot is brilliant, you will have a career. And if this shot you didn't make it, well, you never get into those chaebols.
Yeah.
And that's for if you look to young people, and our friend K.H. Moon, who has been a speaker this morning, we had many discussions on that 2 to 3 million Koreans suffer, young people suffer for not getting a decent job because they didn't get the shot very well.
Right.
And even in such a, well, high sophisticated system in Asia of meritocracy, they should improve a little bit. And what you can say, what we have, especially in Middle Europe, in the German-speaking countries, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, we have it quite. It's you have you can say 5, 6, 7 times short society there. If you even you're not at the point when you're 18 years and you have, well, if you fell in love, for example, some weeks or a year before the exam is, then to not discover this talent because he fell in love is, well, a little
terrible.
bit
Yeah, I agree very much.
Situation. Yeah. So therefore, I think if we integrate both ideas of, well, even in extreme cases, the rat race you said in your book, and the objective ways of meritocracy systems, but also to include, well, the detour ways of young people, then we will find in the future a lot of creative ways, because I'm giving lectures to young entrepreneurs, and some people, they are, well, late runners. So when they are 23 or 4 or 5 or even 29, sometimes they are hungry then with a delay of 10 years.
No.
And I think that's another chance for Europe.
Entirely. So second and third chances and different sorts of opportunities for different sorts of aptitudes and abilities. Absolutely, we need to do that. So we need to improve meritocracy rather than reject it. I agree.
Okay, that was the forum with you. It was a great pleasure for us to have you here, and we are always welcome to come to Mannheim, to Germany, and if you need some contacts to meet, well, some nice guys and entrepreneurs and young women from our network, just tell us, and we will be pleased to deepen the relationships among.
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. We will do that. Thank you. Thank you
so much, Adrian.
Bye-bye. Bye.
For the next meeting, you need a different dial-in number, so please look into our program. I just copied it into the chat. If you look to there on the homepage, you will find the dial-in number for the next session. It will be at 5:45, and there we talk in German about the availability, or how do we deal with the chip bottlenecks or semiconductors bottlenecks.
Thank you, Hermann. Okay, so some of us, we will see each other at the late afternoon this Friday. So it's a long week for some of us, for me, for Hermann, and our friends from our society, Johannes Grimm, Andreas Brückner, and Klaus Regitz. At the moment, before all of you leave our round, I have to say many thanks to our Peter Drucker-Society members of Mannheim to organize it, and many thanks to you, Hermann. Many thanks to Johannes, Klaus, and Andreas. They were the backbones of this summit, and I think we are quite content, and we have really learned a lot. Many thanks.
You're welcome.
Maybe later this afternoon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.